AITA for telling my friend who is dating my sister that she cheated on him. Whose side should I take? I'm a 25-year-old guy, and this all revolves around two key people in my life: my 22-year-old sister, Melissa, and my close friend, Greg, who's 24. Melissa is the kind of sister I have a love-hate relationship with. Growing up, we fought over dumb things, like who got the TV remote, or whose turn it was to do dishes, but we always had each other's backs when it mattered. Greg and I have been friends since middle school. He's practically family at this point, the kind of guy who's been to every Thanksgiving at our house since we were teens. He's dating my sister, and for a while, it seemed like the stars had aligned. I mean, what's better than having your best friend and sister together, right? Or so I thought. The trouble started on a night that should have been fun, a party at a mutual friend's place. A few drinks, good music, and plenty of people milling around. What could go wrong? I wasn't planning to stay long at the party, just long enough to catch up with some old friends and head home. Greg had arrived earlier with Melissa, and when I last saw them, they were sitting on the couch, drinks in hand, looking happy. I figured everything was good. But about an hour in, as I was heading toward the kitchen to grab a refill, I saw her. She was outside on the back patio, standing close to a guy who wasn't Greg. He had his hand resting on her hip, and they were talking in that low, intimate way that makes it obvious what's coming next. Then she leaned in, and before I could process what I was seeing, they were kissing, slow, deliberate, like they had nothing to hide. My sister, Melissa, who had been with Greg for nearly 2 years, was openly making out with some random guy at a party. My first instinct was to barge outside and tear them apart. My heart was pounding, and my hands shook with adrenaline. But then reality set in. What would I even say? Confronting her in the middle of a party would make a scene, and Greg might be nearby. What if he saw this? I couldn't let him find out like this, not in front of everyone. I forced myself to back away, leaning against the kitchen counter to steady my breath. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do next. Was this a one-time mistake or something more? Was it my responsibility to get involved, or was this between her and Greg? The thing that gnawed at me was how casual she looked. This wasn't the nervous fumbling of someone who made a bad choice after one too many drinks. This looked comfortable, like she'd done it before. I couldn't stand being in the same house anymore. I spotted Greg in the living room, completely unaware of what had just happened. He laughed at something a friend said, his arms slung lazily over the back of the couch. The thought of him being blindsided by this made me sick. Without saying goodbye, I slipped out the front door and into the night, hoping the cool air would calm me down. But no amount of fresh air could fix this. The morning after the party, I found Melissa in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone while sipping her coffee. She didn't seem worried, which made my pulse spike. I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries, so I told her straight up that I'd seen her kissing another guy at the party. The way her face shifted, shock, then defensiveness, was all the confirmation I needed. She tried to act confused at first, but when she saw I wasn't backing down, she admitted it. She said it was a mistake, that she had been drunk, and it didn't mean anything. I could barely stand listening to her. Drunk or not, she knew what she was doing, and we both knew this wasn't something Greg would brush off if he found out. I asked her how long it had been going on, but she stuck to her story, swearing it was just that one time. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't meeting mine. She shifted tactics, telling me it wasn't my business and that I had no right to get involved. That set me off. I reminded her that Greg wasn't just anyone, he was my best friend. I told her that by cheating on him, she'd dragged me into this whether I wanted to be or not. What did she think I was supposed to do now? Pretend I hadn't seen her with another guy and watch Greg get blindsided later? Her shoulders tensed as she told me I'd only make things worse if I said anything to him. She said that if I cared about our family, I'd stay out of it and let her handle it. But her version of handling it sounded like burying the truth. I told her Greg deserved better than to be lied to, and if she had any respect for him, or for herself, she needed to tell him the truth before someone else did. She didn't argue after that. She just stood there, silent, as if hoping I'd drop it. But I didn't wait for her to say anything. I turned and left, knowing that whether she came clean or not, this wasn't the end of it. Melissa and Greg's relationship wasn't something I saw coming, and looking back, maybe that's why it hit me so hard when she betrayed him. Melissa had always been unpredictable. In high school, she was the kind of girl who got good grades but skipped classes when she felt like it, sneaking out to concerts and coming home just in time to avoid getting grounded. Her dating life was equally chaotic. She went through a string of bad boy types, the kind of guys who showed up late, smelled like cheap cologne, and left her heartbroken more often than not. Greg, on the other hand, was the opposite of chaos. We met in middle school, bonding over video games and the shared trauma of gym class dodgeball. He was reliable, steady, the type of guy you could count on to show up early and help clean up after everyone else left. He wasn't flashy or wild, but he had a quiet confidence that people respected. In many ways, he balanced me out, and I always appreciated that. Melissa and Greg barely interacted during those early years. If anything, she probably found him boring compared to the guys she usually dated. But things changed after one particularly rough breakup about 2 years ago. Her boyfriend at the time was a classic disaster, controlling, impulsive, and, as it turned out, cheating on her with someone else. When Melissa found out, she was devastated. She showed up at my place that night, mascara streaked down her face, carrying a bag of clothes she hadn't even bothered to fold. I wasn't great at comforting people, but Greg was there, and he stepped in like it was second nature. He made her tea, sat with her on the couch, and listened without judgment. By the time she fell asleep, she wasn't crying anymore. At the time, I thought it was just Greg being Greg. He was always the guy who stepped up when someone needed help, and Melissa was my sister, so of course he'd be there for her. I didn't think anything of it until a few weeks later when she started showing up at our usual hangouts, places she normally would have avoided because they weren't her scene. She'd sit next to Greg, laugh at his dumb jokes, and casually mention that they'd been texting. When they officially started dating, I was surprised, but I was also happy for them. Greg was exactly the kind of guy Melissa needed, someone who could pull her out of the chaos and give her stability. For a while, it seemed like it was working. They did everything together, weekend hikes, coffee shop dates, family dinners where Greg always made sure to bring dessert because he knew it was Melissa's weakness. I remember thinking that maybe this was it for her, the relationship that would finally ground her. But deep down, part of me worried. Melissa had never been one to settle. Even when things were good, she always seemed restless, like she was waiting for something to go wrong or for the next big thrill to come along. I tried to push those thoughts aside. After all, people change, right? And she seemed happy, Greg seemed happy. That was all that mattered. Then, about 6 months ago, I started noticing cracks. At family gatherings, she wasn't as affectionate with Greg. She'd make excuses to leave early, saying she had work the next day or that she wasn't feeling well. Greg didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did and didn't want to admit it. When he talked about their future plans, like saving for a trip to Europe, Melissa would smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. That I should have said something then, but I didn't. I wanted to believe they could work through it. I wanted to believe that the version of Melissa who loved Greg was stronger than the version who always ran from stability. But standing in the aftermath of what I'd seen at the party, it was clear I'd been wrong. Melissa hadn't changed, she'd just been pretending. And now, I was left to pick up the pieces of a betrayal that wasn't even mine but felt personal anyway. After leaving the kitchen that morning, I thought maybe Melissa would take my warning seriously and do the right thing. But 2 days passed, and nothing happened. Greg was still oblivious, texting me about the basketball game that weekend and making jokes about how Melissa had burned dinner again. The longer I waited, the angrier I became. I knew Melissa wasn't going to tell him. She had probably convinced herself that if she just acted normal, this would all blow over. I couldn't let that happen. So, I went back to her room that evening, knocked once, and walked in before she could tell me not to. She was lying on her bed, scrolling through her phone with headphones in. When she saw me, she sighed and pulled them out, like she'd been expecting this conversation but was hoping to avoid it for as long as possible. I told her I wasn't here to argue. I just wanted to know what she had decided. Was she going to tell Greg or not? Her silence spoke louder than any excuse she could have given. She hadn't told him, and she didn't plan to. She tried to explain that it wasn't a big deal, that it would only hurt Greg unnecessarily if he found out. It was better, she said, to leave it in the past and move forward. Hearing her say that made my blood boil. I reminded her that Greg deserved to know the truth, whether it was convenient for her or not. He trusted her. I trusted her. And she had thrown that trust away the second she kissed someone else. She tried to push back, saying I didn't understand how complicated things were, that it wasn't just about the kiss. It was about everything leading up to it. She admitted she had felt trapped in the relationship for months, like she was suffocating under Greg's expectations of a future she wasn't sure she wanted. I asked her why she hadn't just ended it if she felt that way. Why cheat? Why drag Greg through this mess when she could have walked away clean? She didn't have an answer, at least, not one that made sense to me. She said she didn't want to hurt him, but it sounded like a weak excuse to cover up her own guilt. She told me she knew she had screwed up but begged me not to tell Greg. She said it would destroy him, that he loved her too much to handle something like this. I could see the fear in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her. She wasn't worried about Greg, she was worried about herself and the consequences. I stood there for a moment, staring at my sister, and wondering how we had gotten to this point. I had always thought of her as someone who could make mistakes but never like this, never something that would hurt so many people. I told her I couldn't make her tell Greg, but I wasn't going to cover for her either. If she wanted to keep lying to him, that was her choice, but she'd have to deal with the fallout when the truth eventually came out. And it would. Secrets like this never stay buried for long. She didn't say anything as I walked out of the room. But I could feel her watching me, probably hoping I'd change my mind. I didn't buy the third day of silence from Melissa. I knew she wasn't going to do the right thing. The fact that she was dodging me at home only made it worse. But what really pushed me over the edge was Greg texting me about a weekend trip he had planned for her birthday. He asked if he should propose during it. The idea of him getting down on one knee, pouring out his love to someone who betrayed him, made my stomach churn. I couldn't sit on this anymore. I texted Greg and asked him to meet me at our usual bar, the place where we'd spent countless Friday nights shooting pool and downing cheap beer. When I arrived, he was already there, grinning as he waved me over. I sat across from him, but this time, I didn't feel like we were the same two friends who had always shared everything. This was different. I didn't waste time. I told him I needed to talk about Melissa, and before he could ask why, I laid it all out. I told him about the party, seeing her with another guy, and how she hadn't been honest about it since. He stared at me in disbelief, shaking his head like he was trying to wake himself from a bad dream. At first, he thought I had misunderstood, that maybe Melissa had just been drunk or joking around. But the look on my face must have told him otherwise. As I explained more, the confusion faded, replaced by something heavier, pain mixed with resignation. I told him that I'd confronted Melissa, and while she hadn't confessed to much, her actions spoke for themselves. He asked if I thought she ever loved him. I didn't have an answer. I could only say that if she had, she wouldn't have done this. Greg was quiet for a long time after that. He stared at the table, drumming his fingers like he was working through a mental checklist of everything he had missed. Then, without looking up, he said he appreciated me telling him. He didn't sound angry, just tired. We left without finishing our drinks. Outside, he paused before getting into his car, saying he wasn't sure what his next step would be, but he'd figure it out. I nodded, knowing there was nothing else I could say. As he drove off, I stood there for a moment, wondering if I'd done the right thing or if I'd just blown apart something that could have been fixed. But deep down, I knew this wasn't on me. The damage had already been done. The next morning, the silence at home was unbearable. Melissa hadn't left her room, and I wasn't eager to go knocking. I figured Greg must have called her by now, or maybe he hadn't, and she was waiting for the blow to land. Either way, tension hung over the house like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. By midday, I heard her door creak open, and then the soft thud of her footsteps on the carpet. She found me in the living room, sitting on the couch with the TV on, though I wasn't really watching anything. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly like she was trying to hold herself together. Her face was pale, and her eyes were puffy, like she hadn't slept. She didn't ask if I had told Greg. She already knew. Instead, she asked what he had said, her voice cracking on the last word. I told her he had taken it better than I expected, but that didn't mean he wasn't hurt. He hadn't decided what to do yet, but he wasn't blind to what had happened anymore. Her knees buckled slightly, and she sank into the armchair across from me, staring at the floor. She whispered that she hadn't wanted things to turn out this way. She admitted she felt trapped in her own mistakes, but instead of dealing with them, she had kept pretending everything was fine. I could see the regret on her face, but at that point, I wasn't sure if it was genuine or if she just hated being caught. She blamed herself, she said, but then she quickly shifted to blaming me for telling Greg before she had the chance to explain herself. That was the moment I lost what little sympathy I had left. I reminded her that she had every opportunity to come clean, but she didn't. She chose to hide behind lies and excuses, and now she was angry at me for refusing to play along. I wasn't going to apologize for telling Greg the truth. If she wanted someone to blame, she could start by looking in the mirror. Melissa wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt, her breath hitching like she was about to cry but was trying to hold it back. For a brief moment, I wondered if this would finally be her wake-up call, if she'd take responsibility and try to fix the mess she had made. But when she looked up at me, all I saw was bitterness. She said I had ruined everything, that our relationship as siblings would never be the same again. She accused me of choosing Greg over family, as if loyalty meant covering for her mistakes. I told her I didn't see it that way. Family didn't mean turning a blind eye to someone hurting people they supposedly cared about. She stood up, muttering that she couldn't deal with me anymore, and stormed back to her room. The door slammed shut, and the house fell silent again. I stayed on the couch, staring at the flickering TV screen and wondering if she'd ever understand why I did what I did, or if this was the beginning of a permanent rift between us. A week passed, and the silence between Melissa and me turned into something permanent. She avoided me entirely, slipping out of the house early and coming home late, as if living in the same space was unbearable for her now. I didn't try to reach out. There wasn't anything left to say. Greg had stopped texting me, too, which I figured was his way of processing everything without me in the middle of it. Then, one afternoon, I got a message from him. It was short and to the point. We broke up. Thanks for being honest with me. I didn't know how to feel. Relieved that the truth was out? Guilty for how much pain it had caused? A mix of both. But I knew Greg would be better off in the long run. The worst kind of betrayal wasn't the one you saw. It was the one you never knew existed. Melissa moved out 2 weeks later, taking her things without saying goodbye. Mom texted me afterward, asking if something had happened between us. I ignored the message. If Melissa wanted to tell them, that was her choice, but I wasn't going to rehash everything again. As for Greg, we met up a month later for coffee. He didn't talk about Melissa, and I didn't push him to. We stuck to safe topics, sports, work, weekend plans, but there was a heaviness between us that hadn't been there before. I didn't know if our friendship would ever be the same, but I was grateful he hadn't shut me out completely. Before we left, he thanked me again for telling him the truth, and that was enough for me. Now, months later, I think about that night at the party and wonder if I could have handled things differently. Maybe I could have waited longer to tell Greg or tried harder to convince Melissa to be honest with him. But then I remind myself that the outcome would have been the same. Melissa had made her choices, and I had made mine. Was I the bad guy for telling Greg? Maybe, from Melissa's point of view. But I can live with that. If protecting family means covering up their mistakes, then I guess I'm not the kind of brother she wants. But protecting someone you care about, even if it means telling them what they don't want to hear, that's the kind of friend I'll always be.